Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to the August Community IT Innovators webinar series. Thank you for joining us today as we discuss planning and IT project management for nonprofits. Before we get started, we want to share with you a few tips and tricks for our webinar. First of all, we encourage everyone to interact with us via the chat feature in GoToWebinar. We'd also like to remind you to avoid multitasking during the webinar. You may just miss the best part. If you do miss the best part or need to leave the webinar early, we'll be posting links to the recording and slides on our website, YouTube channel, and SlideShare accounts. In case you're not familiar with Community IT, our skilled and certified team of IT professionals serves the greater Washington nonprofit community, helping organizations of all sizes and capacities to advance their missions through the effective use of technology. We're deeply invested in the nonprofit community, having served over 900 nonprofits since 1993, and we take a strategic and collaborative approach that fits the unique needs and culture of nonprofit organizations. And now I'd like to Well, this is the part where I usually say turn it over to our presenters, but today that includes me. My name is Johan Hammerstrom. I'm the President and CEO of Community IT, and I'm joined today by...
I'm Steve Longenecker, and I'm Director of IT Consulting.
And so today is our second episode in our three-part series, and in the third quarter we wanted to focus on IT management. And so last month we talked about building an effective IT department for nonprofit organizations. And this month we wanted to talk a little bit about planning and IT project management. And so this really is kind of a part two of the webinar series this quarter. And if you didn't get a chance, we encourage you to go back and watch the webinar from last month. Like I mentioned before, it's on our YouTube channel. And we talk a little bit about the different roles in an IT department, how you can fill those roles, and how they can help you to establish a strong IT function at your organization. So today, we're going to kind of pick up where we left off and focus specifically on planning and projects. And one of the things that Steve and I wanted to mention at the outset is that we really intend for this webinar to be a little bit more conversational than certainly last month's webinars and some of our other webinars. And our goal really is to share with you all some of the things that we've learned over the years in helping nonprofit organizations plan and implement IT projects. And so we're gonna share from our experiences and hopefully impart some of our knowledge and wisdom to you all, which in some cases will provide you with some immediate concrete tips and techniques that you can use. But in other cases might just help you to think about your IT projects in a different way than maybe you're thinking about them right now. So planning and projects, anytime you're talking about planning for the future or implementing an IT project at your organization, what you're really talking about is implementing a new IT solution. You're planning for a new solution, you're putting a project together to implement a new solution. So we want to start with focusing on that. Get the keys there. So if you recall from last month, for those of you who attended, we talked about the 4 roles in an IT department. And we sort of broke those into what we were calling CIO, PMO, engineer, and help desk. And CIO obviously stands for Chief Information Officer, and PMO stands for Project Management Office. So today we're going to focus on these 2 functional areas, what we've called CIO and PMO, and how they really relate to planning and project management.
Right, and I think when we talked about this during our preparation, we mentioned that, and I know you mentioned this last month at the webinar, but that this does not mean that an IT department needs to have 4 people for this to happen. These are roles in a small shop. It's quite likely that that one person could be having multiple roles.
Yeah, and some of these things you can outsource. Some of them, you can do yourself, even if you aren't necessarily, have an IT background. And actually, that's part of what we're going to focus on today. Is if you find yourself in the position of either having to outsource and manage, or handle on your own, the CIO or PMO roles. What are some effective ways of going about doing that? So just to clarify, the CIO role is the function or the part of an IT department that really focuses on gathering business requirements and doing business and requirements analysis, evaluating different solutions for addressing those business needs, and then basically coming up with the architecture and design for implementing the solution effectively within the organization.
Right, and we didn't put it in the bullet points, but I know I wanted to also mention that in my view, there's another role of the CIO is kind of a management leadership role, and when we discussed this earlier, you were saying that because sometimes this part of the CIO can be outsourced, that there's a management layer has to be sort of above those four roles that we saw in the IT department, and that makes sense to me. But at the end of the day, I think if a CIO is responsible for sort of choosing a solution and figuring out how that solution fits into sort of the overall architecture and design, all of that process, there's a certain amount of selling it to leadership or to management that the CIO is responsible for. I guess if you go back to the slide before, and I'm not asking you to do that, but the CIO, PMO, engineer, and help desk, certainly engineer and help desk don't have to have really any political,
wherewithal
at all. They don't.
Correct.
And PMO shouldn't really have that much, but the CIO has to have.
Yeah, and in some ways, like calling it CIO worked well because it was three letters that fits nicely in this box on this PowerPoint. But it's a little misleading because honestly, like the CIO refers to an executive leader within an organization. And so this is more about sort of the technical capacity around planning. And I think part of it also, in our line of work as an MSP, a lot of our competitors will talk about a virtual CIO, like we deliver a virtual CIO service.
Right.
And this is essentially what it purports to be.
And I get that. But I thought about that since our little argument about it. I still, even if we're the outsourced CIO role, which we are for a number of our clients, we still have there's a political role that we play.
Yes, you're right.
We have to go to our client contact and say, this is the recommendation that we're making, and here's how it fits into the larger political context.
Correct. Yeah.
If we're ignorant of that or ignoring that, we're not going to be as successful in doing these three things.
Absolutely, yeah. To the extent that business requirements end up becoming a political endeavor, which we'll get to. Right. Which we'll get to. Then there's the PMO, the Project Management Office, quote unquote, which is responsible for project management, and we'll talk in more detail about what that means, as well as change management. That sometimes gets forgotten when you're talking about implementing a new solution. The change management is just as important as project management. And then finally, user adoption, which is closely related to change management. And we just had a quick question, great question, thank you, what CIO and PMO stand for. So CIO stands for Chief Information Officer, and PMO stands for Project Management Office.
Right, and when you talk about both, like when someone actually has it in their title, it's probably a very specific thing, whereas we're using it more as a
functional term.
Yeah. We're stretching the definition a little bit.
So this is something that also comes to us from last month's webinar, and this is an ITIL concept, and basically it defines an IT solution as one or more IT systems that enable a business process or function. And this is an important concept to understand because oftentimes people will talk about the IT system as the solution. We get a little bit imprecise in the IT world in terms of our language, and we talk about, oh, Google Drive is a solution, and Office 365 is a solution, and Outlook is a solution. Actually, those are just systems. They become solutions when they deliver business value or enable a business process or function. And that's a really important distinction to keep in mind, and that's something that we'll come back to later on in this presentation.
And we'll probably misuse the term 3 or 4 times on every other slide.
Colloquially, it's hard to keep it straight.
I think we've misused it already today.
Yeah. So here's the big question. How do you select, plan, and implement the right IT solution? How do you make sure that what you're implementing excuse me, is a solution that's a system meeting a business need and not just a system? And you've probably heard this before. Don't jump to solution. That's that's the consultant's canard, as I like to refer to it. The other consultant's sort of common phrase you'll hear is, well, it depends. And people find that maddening. You know, they ask consultants for advice, and they're like, well, it depends, or don't jump to solution. And while that's correct, taking our previous definition, I wanted to make this a little bit more precise and say that the proverb should be, don't jump to a specific IT system. Because oftentimes technology is the solution. The technology system that you implement can solve your problem. And I think by saying don't jump to solution, it sort of implies that, well, the system itself is not going to solve the problem. When in reality, it will, but you can't just jump to the system. You need to consider how it actually enables the business process or function. So the right IT system can be the solution if it delivers value and it is well implemented. And I think this last slide is really key, because oftentimes people, and we'll come back to this, people spend a lot of time focusing on the selection of the solution and then don't spend nearly as much time focusing on implementing the solution. And you can select a system that on paper looks like the right solution, but if you don't implement it properly, it may end up actually it may not deliver the value, that you want it to.
Right.
And this is that is kind of the traditional approach in, software selection, if you will, or just in planning. In IT planning in general, there's sort of this sense that it's a linear approach. The textbook approach is you start off by identifying the requirements. So you kind of list out all of the business requirements. Then you evaluate the solutions, and oftentimes you'll list out the solutions and you'll come up with sort of a matrix, and you'll score the different solutions based on how well they meet the requirements that you've identified. Then based on that scoring, you pick one of those solutions, you go ahead and implement it, and boom, you found the gold at the end of the rainbow, and the problem has been solved. And I think what we really want to emphasize in the webinar today is that picking the solution is not the goal, really. It's not the end of the process. It's actually the journey that you take to that selection is as important as the selection itself. It's as much about the journey as it is the destination that you're going to.
Yeah, I also sort of wonder if kind of what our message today is, like that traditional rubric in some ways still applies. It's just that I think our experience is that sometimes when you're identifying requirements, you're casting it's way too narrow a definition of what requirements are.
Yeah.
Like, and that speaks to this sort of this idea of a journey. Like, understand. We're going to get to the slide about context in a few minutes, I know, but like identifying requirements, that's fine as long as you have a very deep understanding of what requirements mean.
And I think, the other thing we talked about is that in a lot of cases, when you look at the software industry, in particular, often you're not faced with 5 or 6 different solutions that you have to pick from. You're faced with 2 very different choices.
Right.
The classic one these days being Google versus Microsoft Office 365. And I think, we've had webinars on that in the past, and, we get asked that question a lot, like, should we go with Google or Office 365? And I think that traditional approach of mapping out your requirements and doing a scorecard with Google and Office 365 is not going to it's not that cut and dry. There's
not if that matrix is the traditional matrix that you see in a blog post where it just says, can you encrypt your emails?
Right.
And there's a check mark under both.
Yeah.
And you're like, well, I want to be able to encrypt my emails, so good. Either one of these will work for me.
Exactly.
That doesn't answer the question very well in our experience for which of these 2 IT systems will be the solution.
Yeah. Trying to take most software solutions now are essentially going to have feature parity.
For the most part.
For the most part. And the differences tend to be more subtle. And so the analysis needs to be more subtle as well. So this term over-index comes from he's a technical analyst. Ben Thompson writes the blog Stratechery. I'm going to go ahead and send that link out there. He's amazing. If you read one form of IT sector business technology analysis, this is the one to read. He's amazing, and we're huge fans of him. And he uses this term over-index, where you kind of pick one thing and you end up just assuming that that's the driving factor, and you forget about all of the other sort of factors that influence, in his case, the IT industry. So the message here is don't over-index selection. Selection is important, like picking the right software solution, IT solution, IT system that becomes your solution. That is important, but it's not, it's just part of a larger process, and you need to be mindful of all of the different steps in that process. So someone asked if I could repeat his name. His name is Ben Thompson. I'll send that out. If you just go to that website, stratechery.com, you'll find it there. He publishes an article a week online, and then he also has sort of a private email that you can subscribe to. So going back to our original slide, the question then becomes, how do you select, and I reduced the size of the font of the word select to emphasize it, select, plan, and implement an IT solution that delivers value. So again, it's not to say that selecting the right solution isn't important, but you have to consider the implementation as much as the selection, if not more so. All right, so let's see here. So how do you do that? That's the question. And this is the money slide. Context. You select, you have to look at the overall context of the solution and of the system that you're looking at. And we've broken down context into 4 areas.
Yeah, this is the money slide.
This is actually the money slide. The other slide is just a fancy graphic. So you want to look at the political context, the financial context, the cultural context, and the technical context. And if you look at these 4 things and gain a deeper understanding of these 4 contexts within your organization, you're going to be in a great position to plan effectively in terms of your future IT systems and solutions, and you're going to be in an even better position to carry out successful projects.
And I mean, we do this all the time with our clients, and it becomes very second nature to us, to the point that I do worry that somewhat maybe we're just stating the obvious on this, but maybe not. I would say that any place that you see effective CIO and PMO work happening, this is happening.
Yeah.
Whether it's explicitly understood that it's happening or it's just being done intuitively by whoever's making the decision, it cannot be done well without this without awareness of this context.
Exactly. So specifically, you want to, in each of these areas, you want to look at limitations as well as strengths. You want to identify pain points as well as needs. And I think sometimes in the more sort of traditional textbook approach to planning and project management, you know, the focus will be on technical pain points and needs. Well, the server's getting old. We need to replace it.
Well, and the financial is never ignored because it can't be. But the political and cultural is the one that's missed the most.
Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah, and I think, you know, the political, you can't really avoid the politics within an organization, but you can be blind to them.
Yeah.
And then, you know, you don't understand why the project isn't, you know, succeeding. Whereas if you're, you know, if you're paying attention to those things and sort of more explicitly aware of them and trying to address them, it certainly helps clear a path to a more successful project. And then I think the cultural ones tend to be the most, the ones that the people are the least aware of, and the ones that also can really have a huge influence on the success or failure of a project.
Yeah, I think, well, it'll be fun when we get to the actual breakdowns of some of the things that we look at. I think people are aware of cultural limitations, certainly, in a broad way. Like we often talk to our client, you know, primary contacts who will say things like, oh, well, you know, my organization, no one like likes IT or wants anything new, and so that's a cultural awareness.
Yeah. But
it's a somewhat like if that's the extent of the nuance to your understanding of culture, that's a sort of a limited view. It may be true, but there's probably more to it than that.
Yeah, there's more to unpack. Yeah, definitely. So on that note, let's unpack each of these sections. So start with political context. And, you know, who has the authority to make the decision? That's a really important question to ask at the outset. You know, is it, you know, who's going to approve the IT project? What's the process by which the project gets approved? Is there a technology committee that is going to make the decision? Does it go to the senior leadership team? How does that all work? That's really important to be aware of. And oftentimes, you know, things like IT committees have the political history kind of encoded within them. You know, like, why was the IT committee established in the first place? That tells you something about kind of the politics of the organization.
Right. But there can be landmines, and particularly for outside consultants like us, you know, that one of our strengths, I think, as a managed service provider, is that we develop relationships with our clients, so we get to know the landmines. They aren't landmines because we're aware of them. So, you know, you're introduced to a technology committee as an outside consultant for an organization that you're brand new to, and you're told these are the people that, you know, where things really happen. And it's only later you discover they're just kind of a committee. Like, it ends up that it's the president or whatever that really matters, and they sort of want to rubber stamp everything. I'm just making up a hypothetical, but they rubber stamp everything. But then it turns out that, like, you know, they have certain workflows that if those workflows aren't going to work out with this new IT system, you're dead in the water. This project's going to fail.
Yeah.
So if that's the reality, if the reality is that, for example, everybody wants to do Gmail, Google Apps Mail, but the true authority of the organization uses Outlook and has a 15 gigabyte mailbox, and they use it as their filing cabinet or whatever, and all of those things have to remain true after implementation. It's not going to work out.
Yeah.
Outlook with Google Apps Mail, it's not that it can't work, but it certainly doesn't work well with a 15 gigabyte mailbox. And you're going to have some frustrations, and the frustrations are going to be the frustrations of the person who, in the end, was your authority.
Yeah.
And that's a problem. So that's, I mean.
Or, you know, another example, like, let's say the CFO is smitten with the cloud and wants everything to go to the cloud, including the fundraising system. And so they want to move to Salesforce, but the chief development officer likes Razor's Edge, and everything has been built in Razor's Edge, and Razor's Edge is kind of notoriously challenging to move to the cloud. Who ultimately gets to make the decision in that case?
That's right.
And so that's a case where your, run-of-the-mill requirements analysis, feature comparison between Salesforce and Razor's Edge isn't going to be that useful if you don't tackle the political
That's right.
issue.
Yeah.
Also, political, we're calling political as sort of existing organizational vision and priorities. What else is the organization committed itself to in terms of its business and its mission? That's something that's important to be aware of.
Yeah, an example of this might be, and we see this particular priority a lot recently. I don't know whether it's because there's something in the popular zeitgeist right now that it's filtering down to nonprofits or what, but breaking down silos is like, a thing we hear a lot. I shouldn't put it in air quotes like it's such a, it's a crazy thing. It's very important to break down silos. But if this IT system that someone wants to roll out, that you're part of rolling out, fits well with a larger organizational priority of breaking down silos, well, then it's going to get more energy.
Yes.
It's going to get more motivation behind it from leadership.
Yeah.
If it has nothing to do with that,
right,
it might not get any kind of traction.
Yeah.
That's what we're talking about with existing organizational vision and priorities.
Yeah. And as somebody just commented, getting leadership support of projects is critical to successful implementation. And really, the political context is about understanding what you need to do.
That's right.
Understanding the environment within which you're going to be trying to seek that leadership support.
That's right.
And especially for large organizations, although even for smaller ones, be aware that leadership is not always aligned. And that's very important to be aware of as well.
Well, yeah, that sort of skips down to that last bullet point. And we can hop around on here, but we definitely see clients where leadership capacity is somehow not strong, at least not in the IT section, or I should put these in put this in a sort of a. We definitely have seen organizations where there just seems to not be strong leadership, but we might also we could look at it in a more kindly light. There might be leadership, for example. There might be a solution where it really takes maybe a strong hierarchical approach to make this happen. Like you're going to have to to make this work, everyone's going to have to buy in, and to get everybody to buy in, there's going to have to be strong leadership and like the sort of the herding cats kind of idea. Like we're all going to get in line and do this, And if you have an organization where that leadership is there, and that's the sort of the political story, then it's just a matter of getting the leadership to say, yes, we're behind you, we're going to make this happen, But that there might also be, we have seen clients where the leadership style is sort of empower all the different people below to do what they want to do and do it well. And maybe that works well for a lot of the ongoing operations of the organization, not necessarily a bad style. But if you have a project where you need that everyone to be on the same page, and that's the leadership style, getting that leader to sign off, if they're not then going to be able to bring everybody along, that's a problem. Yeah. So there's a lot of nuances here. So leadership capacity has to do with that kind of a thing too. Let's say you get your CEO to say, yes, I'm 100% behind this. Is your CEO able? Able, exactly. Do they have the time in their schedule? That's right. Do they have the energy to be able to focus on supporting your initiative? Right. Is the politics of the organization such that if the leader says, we're all going this direction, that everybody goes in that direction, or is the political environment such that we're all going this direction, and everyone's kind of like, well, maybe we are, and they're not.
But also, like, it depends on the system and solution that you're looking at as well.
That matters and sometimes doesn't.
You know, like migrating email from an in-house Exchange server to Office 365, it's going to be 2 weeks of minor disruption for most staff.
That's right.
Most senior leaders can live with that. Now, moving your files from an on-premise file server to SharePoint, let's say, that may require a significant learning effort by everyone in the organization and a significant cheerleading effort by the senior leadership. You don't want to do that when they're in the middle of trying to secure a bunch of funding from high-profile donors, or you don't want to do that when they're about to launch, you know, a new initiative overseas. What's the capacity of the leadership to support the technology project, depending on the level, you know, of the project? And so that'll influence timeline. Like maybe 2016 isn't a good year to do this project. Should we look at doing it in 2017?
Right.
And that needs to influence the planning process.
Yeah. Yep.
Kind of skipped around here. I mean, I think just say a few quick things about the middle 2 bullet points, because we'll talk about those on the next slide, the financial context. But I mean, it's, you know, the cost benefit value to leadership. I mean, I think there's somewhat of a perception that leaders in the nonprofit space, you know, are pinching pennies and are not going to fund anything. And I think that's largely unfair. Any organization that's functioning and functions for more than just a few years has managed its money fairly well over that time. And so it's really a question of, you know, being able to communicate the value of a project to the leadership and understanding how it aligns with the funding incentives that the organization has. So every organization is funded, you know, from one or more sources, and oftentimes the incentives of the organization are to continue securing that funding. So, you know, how does that work, and how does your project, your IT project, sort of fit into that set of incentives? So,
and sometimes it's very direct. I mean, we have clients who you know, say, hey, look, you know, we get 40% of our funding from a single source, and they're telling all of their, what are they called, fundees? They're telling all of their grantees, you know, we need you to use, you know, a cloud-based, like, program tracking system.
Yeah.
Like, that's important to us. Well, if that's the case, suddenly there's strong motivation to get this to work.
Yeah. Or compliance is another one. Like, we just got a grant. It requires us to be FERPA compliant. All of those, you know, security initiatives that have been on the back burner for years and years and years, they need to happen within the next 6 months, you know. So the funding incentives, you know, I mean, IT has to be aligned with the funding incentives of the rest of the organization. Fiefdoms and pet projects are just important to know about, particularly if they involve other IT systems that may be at odds with the one that you want to roll out. And we talked about leadership capacity. So financial context. This is a little bit different. So funding and funding sources are actually 2 different things. Funding is sort of, I refer to as the level of funding. There's just true limits to how much an organization can invest in IT projects. And sometimes the organization should reallocate its funding so that it's investing a little bit more than it is, but there's a limit to that. You know, no organization has unlimited resources. So just being aware of the funding limits that an organization has is important. And then also the sources of funding are really critical, because, you know, if it's a guaranteed source of funding that is the organization is going to have for an extended period of time, then that, you know, maybe implies a certain type of planning. Whereas if it's a contingent funding source that, you know, has to get renewed every year, or is it one-time funding source? You know, we had an organization that we work with that got a huge grant to do one-time set of improvements, and so that influenced, you know, the planning that we did around that IT project. So it's important to understand that.
Yeah, I think the mistake that we see that relates to that, or one of the mistakes that we see that relates to that, is sort of if you get a big chunk of money that's a one-time thing, there is sometimes, and this relates to the long-term perspectives that's on the bottom, you know, to sort of think about what this money can buy and not think about like the sustainability of what we're going to buy after that money is spent.
Yeah.
Whether it's management, whether it's replacement, because everything has a life cycle to it.
Yeah.
So if you buy this huge sort of server infrastructure, does that mean that you're on the hook to find that money again in 5 years?
Mm-hmm.
Like those things have to be considered.
Yeah. What's the long-term sustainability of the IT system that you're looking at? Ideally, it would be a part of the annual budget. So, you know, when you're doing budgeting, you want to make sure that you have, as these things need to work sort of hand in hand. The annual budgeting of the organization and the IT planning need to go together.
Right. They do usually, but yeah.
They usually do. They usually do. More and more. I think increasingly organizations are realizing that. You want to make sure that you understand what the return on the investment is. This can be a little bit difficult to measure because sometimes the return isn't always quantifiable, particularly in the nonprofit sector. In the for-profit sector, you're sort of always asked to quantify the return on investment in terms of dollars. So there's always kind of a one-to-one relationship between investment and return that's quantifiable. That isn't always the case in the nonprofit sector.
Well, and even in the for-profit, it's oftentimes there's a certain amount of guesswork. You know, like,
there's guesswork.
Oh,
yeah.
Well, this is going to save everybody an hour a day.
Yeah.
And that's kind of a made-up, not a made-up number, but you know, it's an estimate.
Yeah.
At best. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, sometimes you can really find true dollars. I mean, you know, you can definitely like try to look at moving from an on-premise Exchange server to Office 365 and look at the costs of the server and maintenance and stuff. These are estimates to some extent. You can look at that and compare it to the ongoing cost of a cloud subscription.
Yeah.
That's the kind of thing that we're talking about here also. But then also, yeah, not just dollars, cash dollars out the door, but you know, time, morale, I suppose sometimes.
Yeah.
You know.
And ROI kind of takes on a different cast depending on the nature of the project. So like replacing 8-year-old workstations barely needs an ROI argument because these workstations are probably very slow, very frustrating for people to use, probably having a significant negative impact on productivity. There's a certain like baseline level of maintenance that needs to happen on an IT network.
Right. I flip it around and say the ROI argument is the only argument with 8-year-old workstations.
Well, that's true.
Like, you just say, look, this is killing everybody. If you replace these workstations, you're going to spend $1,000 per workstation.
Yeah.
You're going to get that money back within, 9 months because how much time people spend just waiting for their computer to boot up in the morning is crazy.
You spend on IT support trying to fix the computers. Yeah. But then for more sort of, one of the concepts we've referred to in the past is run, grow, transform. Part of your budget is dedicated to run initiatives, what you need to invest in to keep the organization running. Part of your investment goes into grow initiatives, new IT systems that you're in the process of rolling out to add new capacity to the organization.
But within the same context.
Right. And then the third would be sort of the transform initiatives, which are fundamentally changing how the business of the organization and how it works. And I think the more, a transform initiative tends to be more expensive, and you need to have some really clearly articulated return, for the investment that's being made in that case.
Yeah. Yeah. I think what you were saying at the beginning is that, and I agree with this, is that this is sometimes, the idea that you need to have a return on your investment is absolutely true. Sometimes it's a qualitative statement more than a quantitative one.
Right.
And that's fine.
Yeah.
But you do need to be able to say, hey, this is gonna give us returns, and these returns actually have to do fit in the financial context.
Right.
If it just makes everybody feel good, like that's not enough.
Right. We have kind of an example here in Washington, D.C. with our metro system of, the return on the investment is a functioning metro system.
Right.
And that's a qualitative result. Let's move on and talk about the cultural context. So this is the hidden context, if you will. And you want to make sure you understand things like staff flexibility and self-sufficiency. And I think this certainly varies between organizations, but it can also vary within an organization. You can have some organizations where certain groups of staff are very self-sufficient and probably take on, new technology pretty readily. Other groups of staff, would probably struggle with learning new technology systems. So that's a really important thing to keep in mind when you're planning out changes in IT. You want to understand the level of the technical aptitude of the staff, because I think, and the best way to define that maybe is sort of ability to learn, fail, make mistakes, and learn new IT systems, basically. And I think people vary widely in their abilities to kind of, and their willingness to learn new IT systems and their ability to figure out how they work and take those on. And so that's something that's important, because if at a certain point it just doesn't make sense to roll out a new system, you're going to be pushing the boulder uphill trying to get people to learn it if you have a staff who have a lot of difficulty in learning new IT systems. So I think that's something that's often underestimated. You want to understand the cost-benefit value to staff. This really helps with change management. If you don't understand sort of the value of the new system for staff, it's going to be very hard for you to articulate why you're rolling out that new system to staff. And so the cost-benefit is really about experience and time, whereas in the financial context, cost-benefit is about what's the money, cost, and what's the often financial benefit. With staff, cost-benefit is more about how much of my time and happiness is going to have to go into learning this new system, and what's the end result for me on the other side of that process.
And I think it's noteworthy that we have cost-benefit value to staff and cost-benefit value to leadership on two different slides, because those are not always in alignment.
Yeah.
So one thing that comes to mind right now is we confront the fact that we have clients for whom the traditional file server has ceased to be functional enough for people's remote access needs. And so this story we've told over and over again in various webinars, but so shadow IT develops, where people are using personal Dropbox accounts and Google Drive, whatever, to make sure that their files are available to them, wherever.
Mm-hmm.
So from a staff person's perspective, I don't know what all different staff people have different values, and there's that character in Dilbert who's mostly his value is how can I do as little work as possible, and that's what he's valuing.
Yeah. I
think and hope, and certainly our experience of the clients that we interact with is there's a pretty good, generally speaking, these are nonprofits, people who've self-selected to work in nonprofit organizations. Probably they could make more money somewhere else. They're doing it, there's a sort of a mission-driven approach to working here. So people are not trying to figure out the way to do the least amount of work. They want to do their job. They
mm-hmm.
want to help people or whatever they're doing. But if personal Dropbox is allowing them to feel like they're doing that,
mm-hmm.
they're in good shape. Leadership might say, shadow IT is a problem for us because we have no idea where our intellectual property is. We have concerns about staff turnover and what happens when staff turnovers to the files that are in their personal Dropbox. Leadership wants to get things back into the organizational umbrella.
Yeah.
So they want to do something to sort of solve this problem. But it's leadership's problem. From the staff's perspective, shadow IT is working great.
Yeah.
And not necessarily. I mean, you might be able to sell the idea, look, we need people to, it depends. But it's not.
Well, you probably need, and that's another cultural factor. do you have a collaborative organization? Right. Do you have a command and control organization?
Right.
And that makes a difference in terms of how you roll out, how you implement your new IT system.
Right.
Because if you have a collaborative organization, but you take a command and control approach to Dropbox is over, people, we're going with OneDrive, you need to start using it tomorrow, end of discussion. Right. If you try to deliver that message into a collaborative environment, it's not going to work. Whereas if you let people know, well, we had all these great resources, and when, our former development intern left, they went with his Dropbox account, and now they're gone, and you don't have access, kind of tell the story. Right. You'll probably get, more user adoption in that right. case.
And I think the reality also is that with a lot of IT systems, it varies from individual staff member to staff member. So moving, for example, the example of moving files to the cloud, one of the great benefits of that approach to files is that there's a better remote access. Mm-hmm. But you surely have at most organizations anyway, at least a couple staff people who really truly don't work remotely. Mm-hmm. Like they're 9 to 5 people. When they're in the office, they work in the office. When they're home, they're home.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
That's there are people like that.
Yeah.
Less and less than there used to be, but there are still some. So if you're moving your files to the cloud, and it's going to be of a great benefit to 75-80% of your staff because they're traveling, they're working remotely, they like that flexibility, whatever. But you've got your 20% for whom this is no benefit at all, and it's going to be but it is going to have costs. Mm-hmm. Learning new things, You want to be sort of acknowledge that, mm-hmm. and when you're sort of selling this to them, you want to sell it to them as sort of be a team player, blah blah blah, but acknowledge that it's not going to help them, and then stepping back yet another layer, also ask yourself, is this an organization where 20% who aren't getting any benefit are going to be team players, mm-hmm. or not? Is it like a dog-eat-dog organization where these 20% are just going to grumble the whole time and sabotage the whole thing?
Yeah.
You need to know that, and,
yeah.
You probably do.
Yeah.
But you need to ask yourself the question.
Yeah, yeah, and you need to factor that into your planning process.
Right. That's right.
Because the communication with staff is just as important as the deduping of the data.
That's right.
Be very aware of other initiatives and distractions. Don't plan major IT projects right before the annual conference. When you're trying to launch a new program, you need to be aware of, unless you're launching a new system to support the new program, then you want to make sure that you've timed that well also. So I think it's important to just be aware, in the same way that we kind of talked about it with regards to the leaders of the organization. Staff have a certain amount of time and energy that you need to be aware of and can't overtax.
We see this in our own, within community IT. So we want to do certain things, and it seems like it's important, and 6 months have gone by, and we want to get from A to Z, and we've gotten to B, mm-hmm. or C after 6 months. It's like, we had an annual goal around this, blah, 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 and we feel, bad about ourselves. And we're learning, that it's easy to sort of identify all these things that you should do or could do, but unless it's truly important, we at Community IT certainly don't, and I would imagine that most of our nonprofit clients are in the same situation. There really are a lot of distractions, mm-hmm. a very limited capacity to take on something new.
Yeah. So
this is something that I think just people underestimate constantly.
Yeah, great point.
And therefore, unless it's truly important, having the money for it's only 10% of the the situation.
But that can also factor into your planning of an implementation timeline, where you're like, we'll get a month of people's attention and that's it.
Yeah.
So we got a month to get this thing done, even though maybe it could easily be done in 3 months or 4 months. Like, all we've got is 1 month. Let's get everything ready to go. roll it out, get everyone switched over to the new system and shut down the old one. So just being being aware of.
And that's the way our organization works.
And that's the way we work.
People can be really focused, but only for a short burst.
Only for a short burst.
Yeah.
Is important to keep in mind as well. If your organization has a lot of turnover, then
it's hard.
Well, or maybe it's easy because you roll out a new system, no one likes it. In 6 months, they're all gone, and so a whole new crew is there. So that can play in a lot of different ways, but I think it's just an important part of cultural context. And then history, super important. I mean, I can't tell you the number of times we've brought up SharePoint and have had, oh yeah, we tried SharePoint 10 years ago, and and the ghosts are still walking the halls. Like you can't. Failed IT projects just, haunt, Scrooge like you wouldn't believe. So you have to really it's important for you to be aware of that. If you're new at the organization, make sure you understand the history of previous IT projects, particularly if they relate to the specific sort of system that you're looking at or the solution that you're trying to deploy. Whoa, technology, right? We're talking about technology. We're kind of running a little bit low on time here, so I will kind of move.
Give this one short shrift.
Yeah. Obviously, you need to be aware of the technical environment into which the new system is being placed needs to be clearly understood. And, there are all kinds of implications. So, is the new system going to be on-premise? Is that really a good decision in 2016? Does that give you a good 5-year lifespan? Is it going to be cloud-based? If so, how does that interface with other cloud systems your organization might have or on-premise systems that you still have? What about legacy systems? So again, Salesforce you can do a lot of amazing things with Salesforce, but functionally, does it work as well as maybe a legacy? Maybe you have an old clunky fundraising system that you've had for 15 years, but everyone knows how to use it, and it's got the data stored in a particular way. Is it going to be hard to migrate the data out of the legacy system into the new system? How well are you going to be able to integrate your various systems, and how important is that? And this actually becomes more and more of an issue, I think, as more things move to the cloud. Back in the good old days, quote unquote, when Microsoft systems owned a lot of things, you didn't really have to worry that much about integration because
they own the stack and they made it work.
They own the stack and more or less made it work. But nowadays, should you go with Box or Dropbox? Well, how well do they integrate with your fundraising system? How well do they integrate with, your email system? Those are things that are important to understand. And then finally, what's the capacity to support the new system?
Yeah. And we joke. I mean, I think we've emphasized the other 3 boxes in our context slide a great deal more than this one. This is very important, obviously. It's just, I guess our assumption is that this is the one that traditionally gets attention.
Yeah.
So we've focused on the others to emphasize the others in that context. But you wouldn't want to just ignore it.
No. In some ways, technical context is among the most important, of course.
Yeah.
For example, a school that's looking at rolling out Chromebooks, that's a great, well, not great or not a good or a bad choice necessarily in and of itself. I mean, you want to look at what other systems the school needs. You don't want to just move full speed ahead with that and not realize that the ESOL teacher has a program that they use that only runs on Windows machines.
That's right.
So understanding the full technical environment is important, and really understanding how the new system is going to fit into that technical environment is also important, and that can affect the decision that you make. So we talked about these 4 contexts, and it's really about balancing them all. There's no, this is where it's as much art, as science, and this is why I think the sort of linear quantitative scorecard is as appealing as it is because it's so cut and dried. Like, here's the matrix, you fill it out,
right.
Boom, you've got your decision. When you're instead having to balance an existing technical environment with a set of funding sources and funders who have different incentives, with a staff and its history and its ability or inability to use new technology, with management that may or may not support your project, trying to balance all of those different forces really requires a lot of skill and a lot of experience, and it's something that you just kind of develop and build over time. But I think, as we mentioned at the outset, being aware of the context and either just knowing what they are in your mind or sitting down and writing them down really makes a big difference in the planning process. So let's talk a little bit about project management. So once you've kind of planned out the project, how do you manage a project successfully? And I'm calling this project management table stakes. This is not a, and apologies to anyone who attended this webinar hoping to get sort of like a PMP level, tutorial on how to manage projects. This is more about planning and managing IT projects, and specifically at, small and mid-sized nonprofit organizations. These are all things that are really important if you're going to manage a project successfully. So understanding the four contexts, critical. You can't just take those contexts and then just sort of, wishy-washy your way through rolling out a project. You also need to have sort of the basic project management skills, which includes, having milestones, coming up with a work plan at the outset of the project, tying it to the milestones, understanding the dependencies, between the different tasks and activities in the work plan. You want to budget out, whether it's hours or money or time, you want to budget that out and then sort of track that as you're going through. There's logistics that you have to worry about. Ideally, you'd have regular briefings. I don't know why I'm doing all the talking. Steve is our project management expert. He does these things incredibly well all the time. Steve, maybe just what's some wisdom you could share with the audience?
I think working out the plan can be hard. I don't know. That's where when we do stumble. That's oftentimes where we stumble, particularly around dependencies. There's oftentimes when we're doing an implementation, there are landmines in the network. This goes back to the technical context, that we don't uncover early enough in the planning process as we'd like, and so it is definitely an art to, and something that you benefit greatly from having someone who has had experience managing projects, IT projects before, because you have hard-earned lessons that you can fall back on. So I'm just trying to think of a concrete example. Knowing that some printers are shared off of this other server, or that some printers are shared, or use direct IP print. I'm sort of doing a technical weed example here, so I apologize to people who don't get that. Or that there's this one printer that's from 2001, but it's very important because it does a certain kind of AutoCAD printing or whatever that, and we're not going to replace it.
Right.
But it only uses 32-bit drivers. That's all that's available for it. And so you're like, oh, we're going to replace this server, but it's a 64-bit. These
right.
are the kinds of things that can be gotcha.
The little details.
Little details.
Yeah.
And it's hard without having experienced those things to sort of anticipate them.
Yeah. Well, I think I forget the exact wording, but there's an adage that you put the plan knowing that you're never going to follow the plan completely, but if you didn't have it, you'd be completely lost.
Right. Yeah.
So
yeah,
planning is important. Being able to do these things is important. to project success. And then change management, and we've talked a lot about this, so I'm not going to dwell on it, but communicating throughout the project to the entire organization as well as to key leadership, that's incredibly important. Setting expectations is really important. That's almost the most important thing you can do while communicating is setting realistic expectations.
People oftentimes anyway have a large capacity to deal with temporary pain, particularly when there is clarity arogoing the benefit that's going to come from the temporary pain.
Yeah.
Or even if it's a transparent benefit, an understood benefit. Like it's going to look the same afterwards, but I understand and appreciate that it's on a server that has to be replaced because we're running a large risk not to replace it. So I get that. And I have some temporary pain. But pain that's unexpected and not prepared for is a lot different than, okay, it's going to be a wonky Monday morning. I know that because they told me so.
Yeah.
And I come in and things aren't quite right, but there's someone here to help me and it's okay.
Well, they've done studies that if you tell people how long they're going to be waiting on hold, they're much more patient, even if the hold times are longer than if you don't tell them. And that's why a lot of the systems now, when you call in, say your hold time is 15 minutes. But after you get over, you're like, all right, then you make a decision, and then you're like, fine, whatever.
Right.
Whereas
don't have to be on hold for 30 minutes if you tell them 15.
Right, exactly. Obviously. Yeah. So setting expectations, very important, and training obviously is key.
Yes.
So some key questions. How quickly can you move the system? How much communication do you need to do? What level of training is required? Good questions to ask yourself when you're planning the project. We had some examples. I think we've talked about these throughout. We're obviously at time here and don't have time to get into them. We do have some questions, so for those of you who can stick around, we'll try to go through those questions. But real quick plug for our next webinar. It's going to be the third Thursday in September, so that's coming up pretty quickly, September 15th. And planning for an office move. So this is we're going to kind of switch from the more philosophical conversation we've had today to a much more concrete presentation on the specific things you need to do.
Rick and Ganav will talk about office moves. They won't just talk about
exactly the philosophy of moving your office. So definitely encourage you to join that. It's going to be great. Please be sure to fill out the survey after you exit the webinar. If you missed anything, the links to the slides and recording are on our website, and they'll also be mailed to you. And you can connect with us on Facebook. We have our YouTube channel. Find us on LinkedIn. You can follow our blog on our website. We still have a Twitter account. We're doing less and less tweeting, like most people, but we're also on Twitter. So, questions. So let's see. I'm going to go through the list of questions here. Is there a standard implementation phase timeline, or does it really depend on the solution you're implementing?
It really depends.
Yeah. Sorry. Don't jump to solution and it depends. Yeah, I mean, I think when coming up with I think phasing is, we didn't really talk about that, but that can be really important, particularly with larger projects that affect large groups within the organization. Sometimes you can phase it out, whether that's you do it department by department, or you start with the adventurous staff and roll it out to them first, and then the less adventurous staff, and then you end with the staff who are going to be the hardest to transition over. It can be really helpful. And then timeline, you want to, oftentimes I think, you're wanting to move quickly because people are busy and things slide, and it's later than it should be to get the project done. But you need to balance that with leaving enough time to communicate effectively.
Yeah, I would say a couple other things from PM experiences. Any timeline definitely needs to have slack in it for when things don't go according to plan. So always allow time for that. I'd also say that most implementations have like a back end part, a part that's that's transparent to users. Like if you're setting up a new server, there's a lot of work that goes in before the server's quote unquote put into production. And then there's often like a cutover, a user impacting section. And it's the user impacting part that you need to really like think about in terms of these things that, you know, we talked about with people, like telling them what to expect and the hold time and everything. So like, yeah, I think in general, people react better to a short amount of like intense like change rather than like 3 weeks of like little things, one after another. Death by 1,000 cuts people are much less tolerant of than like, look, it's going to be hard. We agree. This, you know, no access to any network resources for an entire weekend, and then Monday morning's going to be squirrely, but then we're going to be good. Is a lot better than we're going to try to do this on the back end. It's going to be little by little. It's, you know, you're going to notice things here and there. That's a lot harder for people to tolerate.
Yeah.
But if it takes you 5 weeks to get to that hard weekend, but the 5 weeks are truly transparent to users because they don't even know what's happening.
Yeah.
Take 5 weeks. Take 6 weeks. Like that's fine. Yeah.
Yeah. That a short amount of pain is better. A short amount of more intense pain is better than a long, drawn out, you know, annoyances.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's good advice. Any recommendations on project management tool?
You know, we have not found one that works well for us. I did do the PMP classwork, and I was in a class with a bunch of people, like a lot of people were from like the defense industry, and they were doing like these massive projects. And I was realizing, you know, it's our clients. We have a variety of clients, but even our larger clients are like 300 seats. You know, not much bigger than that. And so our largest projects, we're feeling like they were almost like a single, like almost ticket in the projects of my classmates.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the project management platforms that are out there are really designed for that really large scale, you know, building a bridge or a new, you know, water treatment center or something,
right.
You know, and you know, hundreds of or even more, or not $1 million projects or $millions project, and you know, our projects are $10,000 or whatever. So I feel like a lot of the classic project management tools just don't scale for us. We have tried Microsoft. We've tried a lot.
Yeah.
We've ended up our own sort of ticketing system has, you know, is something that we use, but that's mostly because that's the way that we get time billed to our clients. I'd say, frankly, for the scale that we operate at, you know, Microsoft Office, you know, Excel spreadsheets and Word docs, and you know.
I think for your standard smaller organization IT project,
Trello,
you should use what you're likely to use.
Yeah.
And that's how we ended up using our ticketing system, basically, for doing project management, because it's the system that everyone in the organization uses to manage trouble tickets and to enter their time. And so we just knew people were going to be in it. And it's not an ideal project management system, but it's the system that people use.
Yep.
The same is true, you know, if your organization has a to-do list tracker, or people are using, you know, tasks in Outlook, whatever the case may be, the chances are for the types of IT projects that are happening at 300 person or less sized organizations, any one of those tools is probably going to work.
The other, I know you want to wrap up. The other thing I would say about that in terms of scale, you know, I mean, these bigger project management systems, you know, again, we're thinking about teams that might be 30, 40, you know, different people, engineers, and all this kind of stuff. You know, our total team is like, you know, 4 or 5 people. It's just very reasonable for us to have a daily huddle, for example.
Yeah.
So a lot of the things that might need to be in a project management system, if you are operating at a really large scale, we're just talking about it. We have a daily huddle.
Right.
And things don't get dropped because we're literally talking about it every day.
Yeah.
And that works for us.
Yep. Another question Oh, we've got time for one more. Are you using Agile methodology in our project management?
So traditionally, for most of our projects, no. Most of our projects, there's an endpoint that's pretty clear, and it's just a matter of like mapping out the way to get there, and it's a
clear deliverable.
Clear deliverables, a fixed cost project, and what we're getting. We have started using our Agile methodology for our SharePoint implementations, and I think it's the right way to approach SharePoint, because with SharePoint, there really is sort of an open-ended, like, you can just keep going and going, and so really it works well to do an Agile approach. And maybe we should say what an Agile approach is.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I mean, so it's sort of the traditional way of doing IT projects is what's called the waterfall, and it's what we kind of outlined in the textbook example early on, where you do a requirements analysis, you come up with a clear set of deliverables, and then you deploy the project, according to meet those deliverables, and then you're done. And traditionally, it's that term waterfall is applied to doing that in software development projects, and specifically custom software development projects. And I think it was about 10, 15 years ago, people started to realize that approach wasn't working particularly well, because until you saw the software, you actually weren't in a good position to develop the requirements. And so a more iterative approach where, you start to see things, and then it sort of changes your thinking about what the requirements should be, and then you see things a little bit more clearly, and then it changes your thinking. You kind of go through this iterative process. You're going to end up with a better solution than if you just try to envision the software cut from whole cloth at the beginning. And so that's basically the Agile, methodology or philosophy. And there's a variety of Agile methodologies. Almost all of them refer to software development. But then that whole approach has kind of been adopted, or at least experimented with, with other types of projects.
So we'll do 25 hours of SharePoint work. We'll get you something. We'll agree that it was good, or it was good, but let's do something a little bit different next time. Let's do another 25. The value that it delivered is clear.
Yeah.
But now let's do another 25, and this time let's tackle this chunk.
Yeah. So Agile is actually probably most appropriate in cases where there's some degree of customization that is occurring, and beyond a certain point or below a certain point, it doesn't make sense to do Agile if you're not going to be customizing the system, because what you're rolling out is just,
it is what it is.
It is what it is. Yeah. Exactly. So we have one more question. How do you communicate project progress with management? It's actually a great question that'll be our final question. I promise. How do you communicate project progress with management?
Okay, so we do a lot of our communication with our clients via email, and then we do a certain amount of conference calling. I mean, we always do a kickoff meeting with a conference call, or even an in-person meeting, depending on the scope of the project, the size of the project, the scale of the project. But I think there's different ways to answer that question. I mean, if you're talking about how do I, not Steve, but I'm the IT manager at this nonprofit, communicate with my management, I would, obviously face-to-face is always stronger, and I think regularity is very important. So, to be able to give a status update at a weekly meeting would be, like, in my mind, a nice baseline.
Yeah, I think working within the existing structures is the place to start. Whether it's, if there's a weekly meeting that management has, see if you can invite it to that meeting to present on the project status. If there's a weekly check-in or an email update, that will get digested by management, try to get on that. If there isn't, then, that's something that hopefully you're identifying in the, political context as you do the planning, and you want to make sure that having that added in is, part of everyone's agreeing to doing the project, is we're also agreeing to be kept up to date, you know,
Right.
on the status of the project.
And it is, it is very, I think, like one of the goals that the PM should have probably is that what you hope to be able to communicate on a regular basis is a sense of momentum.
Mm-hmm.
We talk about momentum with our projects. Like what people don't like hearing is like just sort of the sense of it's stalled or nothing's happening.
Yeah.
So, you know, sort of figuring out what those victories are that you can communicate, that, you know, you haven't heard much about this, but this and this and this have happened, and so that means that this is going to be able to happen next, and so on.
So that would actually suggest that you might be better off not doing a weekly debrief until you have something, you know,
Yeah.
like if there's a month, kind of going back to your earlier point about, all right, let's try to localize all the pain in one
Right.
weekend. Maybe you've got a status update 2 weeks before the weekend of pain, and then another week, and then, you know, the Monday afterwards, and then a week after that. So maybe you're timing it more around the perception or the,
Right.
you know,
It sounds like what you're saying is it depends.
It depends. As long as you're not jumping to solutions, you'll be fine. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. We certainly appreciate it, and look forward to having you back again next month for a much more concrete presentation on office moves.
Yeah. Both of those guys have done a lot of office moves.
Yeah. They're excellent. All right. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Yep.